The coin hit the counter with a sharp, ringing finality that cut through the noise of the general store like a gunshot. Lenora Alden stared at it. A single Liberty-seated dime, worn thin at the edges, its silver face dulled by years of passing through hands that needed it more than they deserved it. She looked up from the coin to the man who had placed it there, and something inside her chest cracked open like dry riverbed in August. Marshal Abel Weston stood before her with his jaw set hard as granite, his dark eyes holding none of the arrogance she had grown to expect from him over the past 3 weeks in Caldwell, Kansas. The badge on his chest caught the afternoon light filtering through the store's dusty window, but it was his hands she noticed most. They were empty now. He had given her everything he was carrying. "You need it more than I do," he said, and his voice was low, roughened, stripped of all the pride that usually armored every syllable the man spoke. Lenora felt the burn behind her eyes before she could stop it. She pressed her lips together and fought it down, fought the wave of humiliation and grief, and something she refused to name that was threatening to swallow her whole right there in Hannigan's General Store, with a half-dozen Caldwell residents watching from between the dry goods shelves. "I don't need your charity," she said, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "It's not charity." His jaw tightened. Something flickered in those dark eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "It's just a dime." But it wasn't just a dime, and they both knew it. It was Abel Weston's last coin, given by a man whose pride was so vast and so armored that half the town had called him cold-blooded. And it was Lenora's last chance to buy the medicine her young cousin needed before the boy's fever climbed past saving. She picked the coin up from the counter. It was still warm from his pocket. 3 weeks earlier, Lenora Alden had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas on the afternoon stage from Wichita, carrying everything she owned in a single leather satchel that had seen better decades. It was September of 1878. And the Kansas summer had not yet released its grip, the prairie stretching out flat and merciless in every direction, the sky above it a bowl of hammered copper that seemed to press the heat down onto the earth like a brand. Caldwell sat at the edge of civilization, a cattle town on the Kisham Trail where the drovers came north from Texas, and the money changed hands fast and sometimes violently. It was not the kind of place a woman arrived alone unless she had no other choice, and Lenora Alden had no other choice. Her older sister, Clara, had written to her 6 months ago from Caldwell, where she had moved with her husband Thomas Reardon and their 8-year-old son, James. Thomas Reardon had promised Clara gold and a future when he brought her out west. What he had delivered was a ramshackle house on the edge of town, and a drinking habit that had gotten progressively worse, until one wet April morning he had fallen from his horse on the way back from the saloon and broken his neck on a fence post. He left Clara with nothing but debts, a sick child, and the faint hope that her younger sister might come. Lenora had come. She had sold the one good piece of jewelry their mother had left her, paid for the stage passage, and arrived in Caldwell with 40 cents, her satchel and the quiet, fierce determination that had always been the most reliable thing about her. She was 26 years old, trained as a seamstress, and entirely unwilling to be beaten by circumstance. She had brown hair that curled in the heat and gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling, because they seemed to take in too much information at once. She was not conventionally considered a beauty in the way the saloon girls were beautiful, with their ribbons and their strategic smiles. Lenora's appeal was something quieter and more dangerous. She looked like a woman who understood exactly what she was worth and intended to be paid accordingly. The first thing she saw when the stage rolled into Caldwell was the marshal's office. The second thing she saw was the marshal. Abel Weston was standing in the street with his thumbs in his belt, talking to a cattle rancher, whose name Lenora would later learn was Harlan Beck. Abel was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by sun and by something harder than sun. He had dark hair that grew a little long over his collar, and a mustache that gave him a severity that the rest of his features almost contradicted, because underneath the severity was a structure that was uncomfortably handsome. The badge gleamed. The eyes were watchful and dark and gave away nothing. He glanced at the stage as it stopped. His eyes found Lenora in the moment she stepped down, and he held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking away, as if she had been catalogued and filed and found not to be a threat or a problem. Lenora Alden had been dismissed by men before. She did not particularly like it from anyone, but something about the casual efficiency of Abel Weston's dismissal struck her as especially irritating, and she filed that feeling away too. She found Clara in a small house on the north side of town, and the sight of her sister knocked the breath from her lungs. Clara had always been the pretty one, the soft one, the one who trusted too easily and laughed too freely, and believed in people longer than the evidence warranted. The woman who met Lenora at the door had Clara's eyes and Clara's hair, but the softness had been pressed out of her like water from a wrung cloth. She was thinner than she should have been, with shadows under her eyes and a set to her mouth that looked like she had been holding herself together by sheer will for months. They held each other for a long time in the doorway without speaking. James, Clara's son, was in the back room. He had a cough that had started in early summer and had not left. The local doctor, a man named Hartwell, had been to the house twice. He said the boy's lungs were weak, and that the dusty Kansas air was not helping, and that certain medicines from the pharmacy in town might ease his symptoms, but those medicines cost money that Clara did not have. Lenora assessed the situation in the first 24 hours and began to make a plan. She needed income. She could sew. Caldwell had exactly one seamstress, an elderly widow named Mrs. Prout, who was increasingly unable to keep up with the demand from the cattle season, when drovers and ranchers wanted new shirts and mended trousers before they went back south. Lenora introduced herself to Mrs. Prout on her second morning in town, sat down at the woman's second sewing table, and within an hour had demonstrated that she worked faster and with more precision than anyone Mrs. Prout had seen. The old woman offered her $3 a week and the use of the back room to sleep in, so she didn't have to crowd Clara's house. It was not enough to cover the medicines James needed on top of everything else, but it was a beginning. She met Abel Weston properly on her 4th day in Caldwell. He came into the general store while she was placing a very careful order for thread and needles, counting out her coins with the focus of a woman who had learned that every cent was a decision. She was in the middle of calculating whether she could afford the coarser thread that would last longer over the cheaper thread that would not, when someone stepped up beside her and set a list on the counter with the decisive authority of a man accustomed to having his needs addressed immediately. She looked at the list, then at the hand that had placed it, then up at the face she recognized from the street. "There's a line," she said, pleasantly enough. He looked at her. Then he looked at the counter, where Lenora's thread and needles and careful calculations were spread. Then he looked back at her. "I can see that," he said, and his voice was exactly what she had expected from his face, controlled, measured, and not particularly interested in being told what to do. "Then you'll be waiting behind me," Lenora said, and turned back to the store owner, a stout man named Mr. Hannigan, who was watching this exchange with the barely concealed delight of someone who had never seen anyone speak to the marshal quite that directly. There was a pause behind her. She could feel it, that specific quality of silence that meant someone was deciding how to respond to an unexpected situation. "Fair enough," Abel Weston said finally, and she heard him step back. She completed her purchase, turned to go, and found him watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not hostility, it was not the blank dismissal from the street. It was something more like assessment, the kind of look that took stock rather than simply categorized. "You're new," he said. "Since 4 days ago," she agreed. "Clara Reardon's sister." She stopped walking. "You know Clara. I'm the marshal of this town. I know everyone." He said it without arrogance, simply as a statement of professional reality. Thomas Reardon owed money to 3 different men when he died. I made sure none of them bothered your sister about it." Lenora studied him. "Is that your job, handling dead men's debts?" "It's my job to keep the peace. Frightening widows doesn't keep the peace." He picked up his list from the counter and addressed Mr. Hannigan without looking at her again. "Miss Alden." She walked out into the September heat and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, processing the conversation. Abel Weston was more complicated than his face suggested, which she decided was both interesting and inconvenient. Over the following 2 weeks, she saw him regularly because Caldwell was not a large town, and the marshal's presence was felt on every street. She noticed things about him that she had not expected to notice. He was scrupulously fair in a way that the men who used their authority to settle personal scores were not. She watched him mediate a dispute between a Mexican drover and a local cattle buyer who was attempting to cheat him on the weight count. The local cattle buyer was more influential and more connected, and Abel Weston ruled against him anyway, calmly and without apology, because the scales had been rigged and he had personally witnessed it. The cattle buyer left furious. The drover left with his proper payment. She noticed that he never accepted free drinks at the saloon, though several people offered them. She noticed that he was the first one at any disturbance and the last one to leave, always making sure that whatever had caused the trouble was fully resolved rather than merely suppressed. She noticed, against her better judgment, that he had a very specific way of standing in doorways when he was thinking something through, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, staring at the middle distance with an expression of focused inwardness that she found oddly compelling. She did not, however, notice that he was noticing her in return, because Abel Weston was extremely good at not letting things show. What was showing by the end of the second week was that James Reardon's cough had worsened. The boy was running a fever that Clara's wet cloths and whispered prayers were not reducing, and Dr. Hartwell had been again to say that the specific medication he wanted to try, a combination of preparations from the pharmacy, would cost $1.60. Lenora had been working for Mrs. Prout for 12 days. She had earned exactly $3.60. Clara needed most of it for the week's food and fuel. The remainder was not $1.60. She spent 2 days trying to make the mathematics work and they refused to cooperate. She asked Mr. Hannigan if he would extend credit. He was kind about it, but credit was something he had learned to avoid since a drought year had left him holding accounts nobody could repay, and the pharmacy was not his to authorize anyway. She asked the pharmacist, a precise man named Mr. Ellery, and he was sorrier than Mr. Hannigan but no more helpful. On the 3rd day she woke up before dawn in Mrs. Prout's back room and lay in the dark, and thought about the fact that an 8-year-old boy's fever was climbing, and she was short by 60 cents, and she did not know what to do. And the not knowing was the most terrifying sensation she had experienced in years, because Lenora Alden was not accustomed to not knowing what to do. She got up, dressed, and walked to Hannigan's general store when it opened because she needed to price out a few things and do another round of calculations, searching for any small expense she could cut to find the missing amount. That was how she came to be standing at the counter when Abel Weston walked in. She had not spoken to him since their conversation 2 weeks earlier. She had thought about him, which annoyed her, but she had not spoken to him, which she considered a reasonable exercise of self-preservation. But when he walked into the store and found her with her coins on the counter, and the expression on her face that she was working very hard to keep blank and composed, something about him went still in a way she noticed even through her preoccupation. He stopped a few feet from her, not approaching the counter. "Miss Alden," he said. "Marshal," she returned and went back to her calculations. "Something wrong?" She looked up. The question was direct without being invasive, and something about the neutrality of his delivery made it harder to deflect than if he had been either aggressive or overly concerned. "My nephew is unwell," she said, because there was no point in lying about something everyone in a town this size would know. I'm working out how to cover the cost of his medicine." Abel Weston's expression did not change significantly, but she saw his eyes move to the small collection of coins on the counter and then back to her face, and she had the uncomfortable sense of being understood without having explained herself. "What's the total?" he asked. "That's not your concern," she said, politely but firmly, because the one thing Lenora Alden's pride could not absorb was the charity of a man she did not know and did not want to need. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Mr. Hannigan and said, "I'll take that order of rifle cartridges we discussed yesterday," and left her to her calculations. She found 11 cents she had missed in a fold of her satchel. She was still 49 cents short. She walked home to Clara's house at midday to check on James, and brought him a small piece of hard candy. She had traded a button for, with one of the drovers' wives who had come into Mrs. Prute's shop for alterations. The boy was pale against his pillow, his dark eyes fever-bright, his breathing audible across the room. He held her hand and fell asleep while she sat with him, and Clara stood in the doorway watching her son sleep with the expression of a mother fighting the particular terror that has no useful outlet. "He's going to be all right," Lenora said, with a certainty she did not entirely feel. "You don't have to say that," Clara said softly. "I know. I believe it anyway." She stood up and squeezed her sister's hand. "I'll find the rest of the money by tomorrow." She did not yet know how, but she believed it because the alternative was not acceptable. She went back to Mrs. Prute's shop and sewed until her fingers ached, taking in an extra piece of work, a wedding dress alteration for a rancher's daughter that was intricate enough that Mrs. Prute had been putting it off. Lenora worked on it for 4 hours and made progress that impressed the old woman enough that she pressed an extra 25 cents into her hand at the end of the afternoon. 24 cents to go. She was on her way back across town toward Clara's house, walking fast, thinking furiously, when she nearly collided with Abel Weston on the corner of Main Street and 2nd. They both stopped. He was coming from the direction of the saloon district, which she knew he walked every evening at this hour as part of his rounds. His expression was the usual controlled, watchful calm, but she saw something shift in it when he looked at her face. She was tired and worried and probably showing more of it than she intended. "Miss Alden," he said. "Marshal Weston." She moved to step around him. "Wait." He said it simply, not as a command but as a request, and it stopped her. She waited. He looked at her for a moment with that quality of focused attention she had noticed before, the kind that felt like being read. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, and then into the small pocket of his vest, and then his hand emerged and he turned to the counter of Hannigan's store, which they were standing directly in front of, and he placed a single coin on the counter's edge. Except the counter was inside, not outside, and they were on the sidewalk, and she realized in the same moment that he had walked through the door of the store to reach the counter, and she had followed him without quite deciding to. It had happened in such a deliberate, quiet sequence that she had moved with it before she registered it. The coin sat on the counter, a Liberty-seated dime. He stood before her with his jaw set hard, his dark eyes holding none of the arrogance she had grown to expect. "You need it more than I do," he said. And that was the moment. That was the crack in the granite of him, the single gesture that undid every assumption she had made about who Abel Weston was. She stared at the coin. She looked at his hands, now empty. She thought about what she knew of Marshall's wages, which were enough to live on carefully and not enough for anything more, and she thought about the fact that this was his last coin and he had placed it on a counter for a woman he barely knew, not with flourish or sentiment, but with the same quiet certainty he used for everything else. "I don't need your charity," she said. "It's not charity, it's just a dime." She picked it up. It was warm. She walked to the pharmacy with the full $1.60 and came back with James's medicine, and she held herself together with rigid precision until she was safely out of sight of the store, and then she leaned against the back wall of Mrs. Prute's building in the early evening and cried, quietly and thoroughly, for exactly 5 minutes. Then she stopped, washed her face at the pump, and went to give James his first dose. She did not see Abel Weston for 2 days after that, which she was grateful for, because she needed the time to organize her thoughts about him into something manageable. The gratitude she felt was straightforward. The other thing, the warmth that had come with watching him reach into his pocket and give her everything he had without ceremony or expectation of return, was more complicated, and she intended to be careful with it. On the third day, Mrs. Prout sent her to deliver the completed wedding dress alteration to the rancher's daughter out on the eastern road, and the route took her past the marshal's office. Abel was sitting in a chair in front of the office, tilted back slightly, reading something. He looked up when she passed. "How is the boy?" he asked. She stopped. "Better. The fever broke last night." Something crossed his face that she was beginning to recognize as relief wearing the disguise of neutrality. Good. She should have kept walking. She knew she should have kept walking. Instead, she said, "I'm going to repay you. The dime." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I'm going to anyway." A pause. One corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly, in a direction that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "All right," he said. She walked on, and the warmth in her chest did something complicated that she firmly told to settle down. She repaid him the dime 9 days later, setting it on the corner of the desk in his office after she had knocked on the open door and found him working over some papers. She held it out to him, and he looked at it, and then he took it with a slight inclination of his head. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the loan." He looked up from the desk. "Is that what it was?" "That's what I've been calling it." "All right," he said again, and this time the almost smile was slightly more definite. She left the office and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, telling her heart to behave itself. It did not particularly listen. The way things developed between them over the next several weeks was not the way she had expected, which was to say it was not simple or straightforward or comfortable. Abel Weston was not a comfortable man. He was private in the way that people are private when they have reasons for it, and those reasons had left marks. She learned them gradually, not because he offered them, but because she was observant and he was. She began to understand, testing the waters of her presence in small increments the way a careful man approaches something that might be valuable or might be dangerous, and is not yet sure which. She learned that he had come to Caldwell from a town called Ellsworth, where he had also been a marshal, and that he had left Ellsworth after something happened that the people in Caldwell either did not know about or were careful not to mention in his presence. She learned from Mrs. Prout, who knew everything about everyone in the way that long-established seamstresses often do, that Abel Weston had been engaged once, 5 years ago, to a woman in Ellsworth named Catherine, and that Catherine had left when she could not bear the constant danger of a lawman's life. Had left specifically in the wake of an incident where Abel had been shot and nearly died, and had decided that she was not capable of sustaining a life built around the probability of losing him. He had not been with anyone since. Mrs. Prout delivered this information with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knew it would not be wasted. Lenora turned it over in her mind. She understood more now about the armor of him, the controlled distances, the way he gave nothing away unless it was the last coin in his pocket. A man who had been loved and then left because he was too dangerous to love would learn to keep his dangerous nature at arm's length from the things he cared about. She wondered if he cared about her, and then told herself she was getting ahead of herself. But she noticed that he had started to find reasons to be in the same part of town she was in. Not conspicuously, not obviously, in ways that she would only observe if she was paying the kind of attention she was absolutely paying. He made his afternoon rounds past Mrs. Prout's shop at 4 o'clock when he had previously done them at 3. He was regularly in Hannigan's general store during the late morning slot when she had her standing order to pick up Mrs. Prout's weekly thread delivery. He had twice contrived to be walking in the same direction she was walking when she headed to Clara's house in the evening, and both times had walked with her without comment, as though it were simply the direction he needed to go. The second time, they had talked for the entire length of the walk. She could not have said afterward exactly what they had talked about. It had ranged from the particular challenges of sewing in dry weather when thread tended to snap to the mechanics of how cattle herds were counted coming up the trail, to a brief and surprisingly nuanced discussion of what both of them had read lately, which turned out to be more overlapping than either of them expected. He had read Darwin. She had read Dickens. They argued pleasantly about whether scientific literature was more or less revealing of human nature than fiction, and arrived at Clara's gate with the argument unresolved, and both of them in the best mood either had been in for weeks. He tipped his hat and went back the way they had come. Clara was waiting in the kitchen with the kettle on and an expression of interest that she was not working very hard to conceal. James, considerably healthier now, was sitting at the table doing his sums, and he looked up when Lenora came in and said, "Was that the Marshal?" "Yes," Lenora said, sitting down at the table. "He comes by sometimes when you're not here," James offered, returning to his sums. He checked that the fence post was fixed after the wind. Clara poured the tea with the serene expression of a woman who was choosing not to say anything yet, which was actually louder than if she had said something. "He's conscientious about the town," Lenora said. Said Clara. "The event that changed the pace of things happened in mid-October, when a man arrived in Caldwell who complicated everything. His name was Doyle Carver, and he had been a deputy in Ellsworth during Abel's time there. He was a lean, weathered man with the particular quality of charm that has been carefully constructed to do a specific job. And the job, Lenora sensed within 10 minutes of being in the same room with him, was to make people trust him before he needed them to. Carver arrived on the Wednesday afternoon stage, and within 2 hours was in the saloon telling anyone who would listen about Ellsworth, about the old days, about Marshal Weston, and a night 5 years ago when something had gone very wrong. Lenora heard the story from Mrs. Prout, who heard it from Mr. Hannigan, who had been in the saloon having his evening whiskey. The story, as transmitted, was this. In Ellsworth, 5 years ago, Abel Weston had been pursuing a man named Roy Culver, a bank robber who had killed 2 people and was hiding in the area. Abel had received information from a source he trusted about Culver's location. He had acted on that information with a posse and they had raided a farm. But the information had been wrong, or had been deliberately wrong, and the man at the farm was not Roy Culver but a homesteader named Frank Deeks, who was unarmed and startled, and in the confusion had been shot by one of the posse members. Deeks had survived. He was wounded, not killed. But he was an innocent man who had been shot by a posse acting on a marshal's orders, and Abel Weston had carried that with him ever since, with the kind of weight that doesn't get lighter. What Carver was adding to this story, in the saloon, was a version that made Abel sound worse than the facts warranted. In Carver's telling, Abel had known the information was questionable and had pressed forward anyway recklessly, because he wanted to catch Culver badly enough to cut corners. In Carver's telling, Abel Weston was a man whose pride made him dangerous. Lenora heard this version and felt something cold move through her, not belief exactly, but the recognition that this version was being circulated deliberately, with a purpose she did not yet understand. She went to the marshal's office the next morning. Abel was there, and when she came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited, he looked at her with the slightly more open expression he had gradually begun to use around her, one that was still controlled but no longer entirely sealed. "You've heard about Carver," he said. It was not a question. "I've heard what he's saying," she said. "Is any of it true?" He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and held them because this was one of those moments where looking away would cost something real. "Part of it," he said at last. "Frank Deeks was shot. He was innocent. I had information I believed to be solid. It wasn't." He set down the pen he had been holding. "I've accepted responsibility for that. It's in the record. Deeks received compensation. What Carver is leaving out is that the man who gave me the false information was Carver himself. The cold thing in Lenora's chest rearranged itself into something more specific and sharper. "He gave you the wrong location," she said. "Deliberately. Roy Culver was his cousin. He was steering me away from where Culver actually was. And now he's here telling a story that makes you look like the one at fault. He's been telling it for 5 years in various towns. Every time I move somewhere and establish myself, he follows eventually and starts the story again." Abel's voice was even, but there was something underneath the evenness that she recognized now as old anger pressed into a shape that could be managed. "I've never been able to prove it was deliberate, his word against mine. And the part that's true, Deke's being shot, is real enough that the rest of the story has somewhere to stick." Lenora was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "Why is he here now? Not just to damage your reputation. What does he actually want?" The look Abel gave her was one of the first looks she had seen from him that was purely appreciative, unguarded, the expression of a man who has had the right question asked and recognizes it. "The Harlan Beck situation," he said. "Beck runs the largest cattle operation in this county. He's been inflating the weights on cattle sold to the government beef contracts, cheating the Army by several £100 per shipment. I have documentation. I was planning to arrest him at the end of the month when the next contract payment goes through. Carver, I believe, has been employed by Beck to come here and destabilize things before I can act." "Destabilize how? Drive you out of Caldwell? Or get the town council to remove me before I can make the arrest? If I lose the community's confidence, the council has grounds to dismiss me, and Beck walks free." He said it with the flatness of a man describing something he has already thought through very thoroughly. "Beck knows what I have. Someone on the county records office was too careless about who saw the documentation requests." Lenora sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "What can I do?" He blinked. It was the smallest of movements, but it was unmistakably a blink of surprise. "I'm not asking you to do anything." "I know you're not asking," she said patiently. "I'm offering." Something happened in his face that was too complex to categorize easily. She saw the reflex to decline, the automatic response of a man who did not accept help because accepting help meant needing someone, and needing someone meant giving them the power to leave. She watched him fight with it, this reflex, watched the argument play out behind his eyes in the space of about 4 seconds. "Carver will be talking to people," he said finally. "Women especially tend to be dismissed when they're asking questions. If you were to be interested in him socially, not genuinely, but enough to get him talking about why he's really here, I could." "No," she said. He stopped. "I'm not doing that," she said quietly. "Because I can't manage it, but because you shouldn't ask it. Use me as a source of information, but ask me to do something honest." The silence lasted for about 3 seconds, and then Abel Weston said very quietly, "You're right, I apologize." She nodded. "What do you need that an honest person can do? The town council meets in 2 weeks. If the community's confidence in me is still intact by then, Beck loses his window. What I need most is—" He stopped. "Time," she finished. "Yes." She stood up. "All right, I'll stop the story from spreading the way it's spreading." She looked at him. "I'm going to tell people what you just told me, the true version. Is there anything in it that's not mine to tell?" He looked at her for a long moment with something she could not quite name moving through his eyes. "No," he said softly. "There's nothing in it I'm ashamed to have told." She left the office and spent the next several days doing what she was, at her core, very good at, working within the networks of women in a small town. She talked to Mrs. Prout, who knew everything. She talked to the wives of council members, carefully and specifically, offering the full story with its context and its evidence in the understated and credible way that registers more convincingly than drama. She talked to Clara, who talked to 2 women from their church who were married to the most vocal of the men in the saloon who had been listening to Doyle Carver. She did not raise her voice. She did not cast Carver as a villain in explicit terms. She simply offered the complete picture where only the partial one had been available, with the specific detail about whose cousin Roy Culver was and what that meant, and she let people do the mathematics themselves. Doyle Carver found, over the course of about 5 days, that his story was landing differently than it had been landing. People were asking questions he hadn't prepared for. The atmosphere was not what he had come to create. He came to Mrs. Pruitt's shop on a Friday morning, which was when he knew Lenora would be there, because Caldwell was a small town, and anyone could know your schedule if they wanted to. He was charming in the way she had anticipated, and she was pleasant in the way that people who see through charm can be pleasant without being vulnerable to it. He circled around what he wanted to say for several minutes, admiring her work, making small talk about the town, before he said casually, "You and the Marshal seem to be friendly." "We're neighbors in a small town," she said, cutting thread with precise scissors. "He's a difficult man to know," Carver said. "Most people worth knowing are," she said. He looked at her with the eyes of someone recalculating. "He tell you about Ellsworth?" "Some," she said. "He told me about Frank Deeks. He also told me about Roy Culver and whose cousin Roy Culver was." She kept sewing, not looking up. "It's an interesting story, Mr. Carver. I can see why you tell it so often." The silence that followed was several degrees colder than the ones that had preceded it. She kept her eyes on her work. Carver left the shop without another word. She told Abel that evening, and she watched the something that moved through his face when she described the conversation. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was closer to the expression of a man who has been alone with a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has been unexpectedly helped to set it down for a moment. "He'll be leaving town soon," he said. "I think so," she agreed. They were standing outside the shop in the cool October evening, the sun dropping behind the flat western horizon in the extravagant colors that were one of the few genuinely beautiful things about the Kansas prairie. She was holding her sewing basket. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, not his usual posture, which meant he was not entirely at ease, which she found quietly significant. "Lenora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix, and she felt it land somewhere central. She waited. "I don't know how to," he stopped, started again. "I'm not easy company. I'm aware of that. I'm aware that what I do every day is dangerous and that the people who—" He stopped again, and this time the pause was longer, and she watched him navigate something that was clearly costing him. "The people who care about you live with that danger," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Catherine couldn't. I understood why. I still understand why." "I heard about Catherine," she said, "from Mrs. Pruitt." He made a sound that might have been a wry breath. "Of course you did." "She wasn't wrong about the danger," Lenora said. "She was just not the right person for that particular kind of courage. That's not a failing in her, it's just a fact." He looked at her. "You're very calm about it." "I've had a complicated couple of months," she said. "I've had to be calm about a great many things. I find it helps." The sunset was doing something spectacular behind her, but Abel Weston was not looking at the sunset. He was looking at Lenora Alden with an expression of open, unguarded attention that was different from anything she had seen on him before, different from the professional watchfulness and the careful assessment and even the almost smiles. This was him looking at her the way he had probably not looked at anything in years, with the full force of his attention undivided and undefended. "I think I've been moving toward this conversation since you told me there was a line," he said. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, and she saw it surprise him too, and then something in his face loosened entirely and he smiled fully for the first time she had seen, and it was a remarkable smile. It was the smile of the man under all the granite and the professional armor, and she thought, "Oh, there you are." "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, if you'd accept that." "I'd accept that," she said. Doyle Carver left Caldwell 3 days later without ceremony, taking the morning stage east. Lenora watched it from Mrs. Pruitt's window and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem resolved by thoroughness rather than force. Abel Weston made his arrest of Harlan Beck on the last Thursday of October, with the documentation complete, and the county sheriff's office involved as a secondary authority to ensure the arrest was unambiguous. Beck went into custody protesting loudly about his influence and his connections, and Abel listened to this with the serene patience of a man holding all the correct paperwork and said, "You're welcome to mention all of that to the judge in Wichita, Mr. Beck," and closed the cell door. The town council meeting 2 days later was brief and uneventful and concluded with Abel Weston's position fully intact. The council chairman, a dry goods merchant named Mr. Whitfield, made a short speech about the value of an honest lawman and shook Abel's hand, and Abel received this with the contained dignity he received everything. But Lenora, standing at the back of the room beside Clara, saw the particular quality of stillness that settled over him when the thing he had been fighting to protect was confirmed safe, and she understood it as relief. He found her afterward, outside the town hall in the early November cold, and they walked together without a specific destination, which was becoming their habit, both of them bundled in coats now that the prairie had traded its summer heat for the knife-edged wind that came down out of the north without apology. "It's done," he said. "For now," she said, because she was not a woman who lied to people she cared about. "For now," he agreed, and there was something almost amused in it. "You don't comfort people very gently. I comfort people accurately. I find it lasts better." He was quiet for a moment, walking, and then he said, "My salary is $200 a year. This town is not particularly large or safe or promising. The work is what it is." She looked at him sideways. "Are you describing your prospects?" "Yes." "To whom?" "To you." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and in the cold November evening, with the stars beginning to assert themselves over the flat dark of the prairie, he looked at her with everything he had and said, "I love you. I want you to have that information before you decide anything." She stopped breathing for approximately 2 seconds. Then she said, "That's a very practical way to declare love. I'm a practical man." "You're not," she said softly. "You're a man who read Darwin and argues about Dickens and gave away his last coin to a woman he barely knew because he couldn't stand the thought of her not having what she needed." She stepped toward him. "You're romantic in the specific way that people are who won't admit it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he lifted his hands and cupped her face with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who is holding something he values beyond calculation, and kissed her in the November cold on the edge of the Caldwell Main Street while the stars came out. It was a very good kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have been moving toward each other through difficulty, and through pride, and through circumstance, and have finally arrived. When they separated, both of them were quiet for a moment in the specific way of people processing something significant. "I love you too," she said. "For the record." He exhaled slowly, something releasing in the whole set of his body. "All right," he said, and this time when he said it, the particular word carried everything that it had always been quietly carrying since the first time he had said it to her, which was that Abel Weston, who gave away nothing easily, was giving her everything he had. The winter of 1878 in Caldwell was the kind of winter that tested what people were made of, with cold that came in off the plains like a judgment and snow that fell in horizontal sheets when the wind drove it. The cattle season had ended and the drovers had gone south, and the town had contracted into itself, smaller and quieter, the way it always did when the money and the noise of the trail went with the season. Lenora kept sewing. Mrs. Pruitt's shop was warm, and the winter brought its own kind of work, heavier garments and mended coats, and the particular requests that came with the Christmas season, which Lenora found she enjoyed more than she had expected. She had always loved the precision of the work, the way a garment could be made from nothing but flat cloth and patient hands into something that had shape and dignity and purpose. In Caldwell, with a reason to be here that went beyond her original errand of necessity, she found the work satisfying in a deeper way than before. James recovered fully through November and was by December running around the yard with the energy of a boy who had been cooped up too long and was making up for it aggressively. Clara had begun to regain some of the softness that the hard years had pressed out of her. She had made friends in the church, had started helping with the Sunday school, was beginning to look like a version of herself that the future might build on. Abel came to dinner at Clara's house for the first time in late November, and sat at the table with the careful good manners of a man who understands the significance of the occasion and is treating it accordingly. James, who had long since decided that the marshal was interesting, asked him detailed and specific questions about every aspect of law enforcement that he had been saving up, and Abel answered all of them with a seriousness that James clearly appreciated, and that made Clara press her lips together to contain her expression, and Lenora fall a little more in love with him. After dinner, when James had gone to bed and Clara had found a reason to be in another part of the house, Abel helped Lenora carry the dishes to the kitchen, and they washed them together in the companionable quiet that had become one of her favorite things about being around him, the way they could be together in silence and have it feel like closeness rather than absence. "Clara approves of you," she said. "I'm relieved to hear it," he said, drying a plate. "She's a good judge." She was fooled once, but that was a particular kind of fool who was designed to fool her. She sees clearly now. He set the plate down and looked at her. She wasn't the only one who was designed to fool you. She met his eyes. Carver was sent by Beck, but before that, some time ago, there was someone I trusted in Ellsworth who was not what they appeared, and it wasn't just Carver. He was quiet for a moment. I spent a long time after that deciding that I was better off without investment, in people, in permanent arrangements. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I've changed my mind." He looked at her with the directness that was one of the things she loved most about him, the way he did not make her look for the truth of what he felt, but placed it in front of her plainly. "I've been thinking about asking you to marry me. I wanted you to know I was thinking it before I actually asked it, so you had time to consider it without the pressure of the moment." She stared at him. "You're warning me that a proposal is coming. I'm giving you preparation time, yes." "Abel," she said, and the way his name sat in her mouth was something she was still getting used to, the warmth of it. "Yes, ask me." He looked at her steadily. "Will you marry me, Lenora?" "Yes," she said. "I've had adequate preparation time." He laughed. It was full and genuine, and she felt it reverberate through the small, warm kitchen and settle somewhere permanent. They married in March of 1879, when the worst of the Kansas winter had relinquished its grip, and the first hesitant green was beginning to show on the prairie, which even at its most austere was making an effort at beauty. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church, which was small and plain and smelled of wood and candle wax, and was attended by everyone Lenora had come to know in the months since her arrival. Mrs. Prout sat in the front row with a handkerchief she used freely and without apology. Clara sat beside her with James, who was wearing his best clothes and had polished his boots himself, and looked extremely serious about the whole proceeding in the way that 9-year-olds do when they have decided something is important. Lenora wore a dress she had made herself from a pale blue fabric she had been setting aside for months, working on it in the early mornings before the rest of the shop opened, putting into it everything she knew about making something beautiful from careful and patient hands. It was the finest thing she had ever sewn, and she wore it with the quiet pride of a woman who has made her own occasion. Abel stood at the front of the church in the good suit he owned, which was dark and well-pressed and made him look exactly as serious and exactly as handsome as he was, and when she walked down the aisle toward him, he watched her the whole way with the expression she had first seen in full on that November evening when he told her he loved her. Open, unguarded, nothing held back. They said their vows in the plain and direct way of both of them, without elaboration, meaning every word. When the minister finished, and Abel kissed her in the quiet church with the spring light coming through the windows and the whole small collection of people who mattered to them watching, Lenora felt something settle around her that was not the peace of absence but the peace of arrival, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. The reception was held in the town hall, which had been decorated with the practical festivity of a community that celebrates because life is hard, and therefore worth celebrating when it gives you reason. There was food and there was music and there was dancing, and Abel danced with her, which she had not known he could do, and when she said so he said, "There are several things you don't know about me yet," with a straight face and the slight glint in his eyes that she now recognized as his version of mischief. "Tell me one," she said. "I used to play fiddle," he said, "before I came west." She leaned back to look at him. "You play fiddle." "Played, I'm out of practice." "Abel Weston," she said, "you have hidden depths that are going to take me years to fully discover." "I was counting on that," he said, and danced her around again, and she laughed with her whole self. James danced with Clara, and then demanded to dance with Lenora, which she agreed to immediately, and they performed a very enthusiastic version of a reel that left both of them slightly out of breath. Abel watched this with the expression of a man witnessing something he had not realized he was allowed to want, and has now been given permission for. Later, much later, when the celebration had wound down and the last of the well-wishers had gone home, and they were alone in the small house that Abel had been renting on the edge of town, and that they had spent the last weeks making into something jointly theirs, Lenora sat on the edge of the bed in her blue dress, and Abel sat beside her, and neither of them spoke for a while, comfortable in the particular way of people who know each other well enough that silence is not a gap. "I keep thinking about the coin," she said finally. He looked at her. "The dime? Yes, I keep thinking about the fact that you gave it to me. That was the moment I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were not who you appeared to be, that the armor was not the truth of you." She turned to look at him. "That man in the general store who put his last coin on the counter without making a story out of it or asking for anything in return, that was the real one." His expression was open in the way it was only ever open with her now, the full version of him visible. "I knew when you told me there was a line," he said. She smiled. "Before I had even spoken a full sentence to you. You spoke it like someone who expected to be listened to." He looked at her quietly. "I hadn't met many people who expected that without demanding it." She reached over and took his hand. "The dime," she said. "Do you know what you were really giving me?" "What was I giving you?" "Evidence," she said. "That there was someone in this town who would see that I needed something and do something about it with nothing in it for him. After Thomas and what he did to Clara, after the stage ride into a town I didn't know with 40 cents in my pocket, I needed evidence that people could still surprise me in the right direction." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me that." Abel Weston was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing this with the same focused inwardness she had noticed from the very beginning, the way he turned things over thoroughly before he responded. "I didn't know that's what I was doing," he said. "I just knew that you needed the 10 cents and I had it." "That's the best version of generosity," she said, "the kind that doesn't know it's being generous." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was so quiet and so certain that it meant more than any elaborate declaration could have. "Lenora," he said. "Yes. I'm very glad you got off that stage." "So am I," she said. "Though I'll admit the first 30 seconds I wasn't sure. I dismissed you. You filed me under not a threat and moved on." "I was wrong," he said seriously. "You were absolutely a threat." She laughed and he kissed her, and outside the window the Kansas prairie stretched away under the first warm night of the year that felt genuinely like spring, with the smell of new grass and the wide, infinite dark of the sky above. The following spring, in April of 1880, their son was born. He arrived with the efficient impatience that would characterize his personality, some 3 weeks ahead of the midwife's estimate, on a Tuesday afternoon when Abel was in the middle of his rounds, and had to be summoned back by Mr. Hannigan's youngest boy running the full length of Main Street at a sprint. Abel arrived at the house to find Clara already there, competent and calm, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Thornton, in charge of operations. He was not permitted into the room. He sat in the kitchen with James, who was now 10 and had assumed the demeanor of a young man taking a responsible interest in proceedings. "Mrs. Thornton says it's going well," James reported. "Good," Abel said. "She also said to stop pacing because she could hear you through the door." Abel sat down. 37 minutes later, Their son entered the world with a declaration of his opinions that could be heard clearly in the kitchen. Abel was permitted in. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at Lenora, who was exhausted and flushed and entirely herself, and at the small red objecting bundle in her arms, and something moved through him that was too large to contain in any expression he had available. "Come here," Lenora said, and he came to sit beside her. She transferred the bundle to him with the matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, and he held his son with careful hands, the same careful hands that had placed a dime on a counter, and looked down at the small, scrunched face that was still deciding whether the world was acceptable. "Henry," she said. It was the name they had discussed. "Henry Abel Weston." "Henry," he repeated, and the boy, as if recognizing his name, briefly stopped objecting to the world and opened his eyes, which were dark like Abel's, and looked up at his father with the unfocused seriousness of someone just arrived. Abel Weston looked at his son, and then at his wife, and said nothing for a long moment because there was nothing adequate to say, and Lenora, who understood this, simply took his free hand and held it. Clara, coming in quietly to see if anything was needed, found them this way and went back out to give them the moment, and told James in the kitchen that everything was fine, and James said, obviously, with the authority of someone who had never doubted it, and went back to his school book. The years that followed had the texture of real life, not always easy, not always simple, but rich in the specific way that things are rich when they are built on a foundation that was chosen carefully and maintained with attention. Abel's position in Caldwell solidified. He was reappointed by the town council without opposition for 3 consecutive terms, and his reputation developed into the particular kind of reputation that is built not on drama but on consistency. He was the marshal who showed up. He was the marshal who was fair. He was the marshal who, when a young Mexican family was being driven off land, they had valid claim to buy a rancher with more confidence than legal standing, spent 3 weeks corresponding with the county office in Wichita, and produced the documentation that confirmed their title. He was also the marshal who, when necessary, could be quietly and absolutely immovable, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice, because the authority of his certainty was sufficient. Lenora's work evolved too. Mrs. Prout retired in 1881, and instead of simply continuing in the old woman's shop, Lenora negotiated to purchase the business, taking on a small loan from the bank and paying it off with the fierce punctuality of someone who had not forgotten what it felt like to be short of 60 cents. She expanded the shop, took on an assistant, a young woman named Rosa whose family had recently come up from Texas, and developed a dressmaking enterprise that served not just the women of Caldwell but those on the surrounding ranches, as the cattle trade continued and the prosperity of the region grew. She and Abel talked about everything. That was one of the things she valued most, beyond the love and the physical tenderness and the partnership, which were real and sustained. They talked about everything, in the evenings after Henry was in bed, in the mornings before the day started, on the walks they still took around the town in the habit they had formed when they were learning each other. They disagreed about things and argued them out, and neither of them capitulated to please the other, which meant that, when they arrived at agreement, it was genuine agreement and therefore meant something. They argued about politics, about the treatment of the Indian nations, whose land this had been before the cattle trails came, and whose situation troubled Lenora in ways she could not always articulate but never stopped feeling. They argued about Henry's education and what it should prioritize. They argued pleasantly about fiction and with slightly more heat about money, not because there was not enough of it, but because Abel's instinct was always toward caution and Lenora's was toward calculated risk, and the marriage of these 2 tendencies required negotiation. The arguing was, in its own way, as intimate as everything else. It was the language of 2 people who respected each other enough to mean what they said. Henry grew. He was a serious, curious boy who had his mother's gray eyes, and his father's contained intensity, with a laugh that arrived rarely but was worth the wait. He rode almost before he walked, which Abel took responsibility for, and he read everything he could obtain, which was Lenora's influence. By the time he was 5, he was following his father around town with the purposeful concentration of someone conducting a thorough study. And Abel, who had never spoken much about his childhood, found himself doing something he had not anticipated: talking. Henry's questions pulled things out of him with the innocent persistence of a child who does not know yet that some things are kept. In the fall of 1883, Lenora discovered she was carrying a second child. She told Abel on a Wednesday evening while they were sitting on the porch after Henry had gone to bed, watching the stars emerge over the flat Kansas sky, which in all the years she had lived here she had never entirely stopped finding astonishing. He was quiet for a moment after she told him, and then he reached over and took her hand with the same deliberate care he had always used with her and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "Tired, but that seems to be the condition." "Henry will have opinions," he said. "Henry has opinions about everything." "This is true." He squeezed her hand. "I'm very glad." "So am I," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the comfortable darkness and listened to the night sounds of the prairie, the insects and the wind, and the distant cattle lowing from someone's pasture. "I keep thinking about how different this is from what I thought my life was going to look like when I was on that stage from Wichita." "What did you think it was going to look like?" "I thought it was going to be a rescue operation," she said. "Come help Clara make enough money to sustain things and then figure out the next stage from there." I was thinking purely in practical terms. I had no plans that involved. She gestured vaguely at the house, the porch, the life. "A marshal with a coin," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. She laughed softly. "A marshal with a coin, yes." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I had no plans that involved a seamstress who told me there was a line." "Was that the beginning, truly?" "That was the beginning, truly." He settled her more comfortably against him. "You looked at me like I was simply a person. Most people don't do that. Most people look at the badge first." "The badge is interesting," she said. "You're more interesting." In the darkness, she felt rather than saw him smile, that full and real smile that she had first seen on a November evening and had never gotten tired of. Their daughter arrived in April of 1884, and she was named Clara Adelaide Weston, for her aunt, and for the woman who had been Abel's grandmother and who he had mentioned once, briefly, in a way that told Lenora the mention was significant. Clara came into the world with considerably less drama than her brother but considerably more determination once arrived, and she looked at the world from her first week with the assessing gray gaze that was entirely her mother's, and that Abel said privately to Lenora made him feel immediately that she was going to make everyone's life richer and more complicated. James Reardon, who was 15 by this point and had grown into a thoughtful young man who spent a good deal of time at the Weston house, and had quietly come to think of Abel as the closest thing to a father figure he had ever had, held his new cousin for the first time with the careful reverence of a teenage boy who does not want to drop something small, and said, "She's looking at me like she knows something I don't." "She probably does," Lenora said. Clara the elder had, by this point, found something that had been absent from her life for the years of struggle, a future of her own construction. She had taken over the Sunday school teaching permanently, was deeply embedded in the women's society of the church, and in the spring of 1884 received a proposal from a widower named Robert Ainsworth, who had come to Caldwell to manage the new branch office of a Wichita banking company. He was quiet and steady and treated Clara with a respect that made Lenora watch him carefully for several months before deciding she approved. Clara married Robert Ainsworth in June of 1884, and James gained a stepfather who turned out to be exactly what a steady, thoughtful, quietly good man can be for a boy who needs one. The town of Caldwell changed too, as the decade turned and the cattle trade evolved. The railroad reached further, changing the logic of the trail drives. New settlers came with different ideas about the land. The particular wild flavor of a cattle town at the height of the trail era began to smooth itself toward something more settled and more ordinary, which was both a loss and a relief. Abel's work changed with it. The immediate physical danger that had been constant in the early cattle seasons diminished as the town grew more established. He was still Marshal, still the bedrock of the town's order, but the nature of the work shifted from the acute to the structural, from physical confrontation to the slower, harder work of keeping a growing and increasingly complex community fair. He was offered the position of county sheriff in 1886 and talked it through with Lenora for several evenings before declining. The county seat was in Wichita, and moving there would have meant uprooting Henry's school, Lenora's shop, Clara's settled life, the whole established world they had built. He declined with the same directness he brought to everything and without apparent regret, and when Lenora asked him about it he said, "Everything I want is already here." Henry was 6 when his father said that, and he was at the table doing his sums, and he looked up and said, "What about me? What do I want?" Abel looked at his son with the fully present attention he always gave him. "What do you want?" "To be a lawyer," Henry said, with the immediate certainty of someone who has been thinking about it for a while. "Or maybe a doctor, I haven't decided." "You have time," Abel said. "Father says you have time," Lenora added, "but you should probably also finish your sums." Henry considered this and returned to his sums with the philosophical acceptance of someone temporarily outvoted. Clara Adelaide, who was 2.5 and had the vocabulary of a considerably older child and absolutely no compunction about using it, said from under the table where she had been investigating something, "I want a dog." Abel and Lenora looked at each other. They got a dog. His name was Kit, a red-and-white hound who arrived in the summer of 1886 as a puppy, and immediately established himself as a full member of the household with the cheerful certainty of a creature who has never doubted his welcome. Henry, who had claimed the dog was too much responsibility when it was first proposed, was Kit's devoted companion within 48 hours. Clara Adelaide carried him around in a manner that was not entirely safe for either of them, and that he tolerated with a patience that suggested he understood his domestic role. Abel, who claimed he had no particular feelings about dogs, could regularly be found in the evenings with Kit stretched across his boots while he read. One evening in the late fall of 1886, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and they were sitting by the fire in the way they had sat together in various versions for the years of their marriage, Lenora looked up from her mending and said, "Do you remember what you said to me when you put the dime on the counter?" He looked up from his book. "You need it more than I do." "You said it like it was nothing," she said. "Like it was the simplest thing in the world to give away everything you had." "It was a dime," he said. "Abel." He looked at her with the full, open attention that the years had not diminished. If anything, the years had deepened it, given it a quality of settled certainty that was different from the intensity of new love and more sustaining. "I know what you mean," he said. "I know it was more than a dime. What were you thinking when you put it down?" He considered this for a moment, the way he considered everything worth considering. "I was thinking that I had watched you for weeks trying to solve something that shouldn't have been yours alone to solve, and I had something that could help. And the idea of not giving it to you because of what it might cost me seemed," he paused, "it seemed less important than the alternative." She set down her mending. "That's not pride," she said, "for a man who was called proud by half this town when I arrived here." "No," he agreed, "I suppose it isn't. What is it?" He looked at her across the warm, fire-lit room, with Kit asleep at his feet and their children asleep in the rooms beyond, and the whole accumulated life of their years together present in everything around them. "Love, I think," he said quietly. "Even then, before I had a name for it." She was quiet for a moment, and the warmth of it moved through her in the way it always did, not the sharp, bright thing of the early months, but the deep, sustaining kind that runs through everything. "I think so too," she said. She picked up her mending. He returned to his book. Kit shifted against Abel's boots and made a small contented sound. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the Kansas night stretched away in all directions, immense and dark and full of stars, the same sky that had been above this prairie for as long as anything could be named, indifferent to the small warm lights of human habitation, but not perhaps entirely unaware of what burned inside them. In the spring of 1888, Henry Weston, who had been 9 years old when his sister was born and was now 12 and growing fast, wrote an essay for his school about the law that his teacher read aloud to the class and then kept a copy of. The essay argued that the law was only as good as the people who chose to enforce it with fairness rather than convenience, and that the truest test of a lawman was not what he did when it was easy, but what he did when it would have cost him less to look away. Lenora read it at the kitchen table while Abel was at the office, and she sat with it for a long time after she finished, because she recognized in her son's clean, careful sentences a truth that had been the foundation of everything she had found in Caldwell. She showed it to Abel when he came home that evening, and he read it standing up at the kitchen counter, still in his coat, and she watched his face as he read it and saw the thing that moved through it that she knew now was the movement of a man being touched by something he had not expected. He set the paper down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's going to be better than I am." "He's going to be remarkable," she agreed. "He gets it from both of us." Abel looked at her, and the quiet smile came, the real one, the full one that she had seen for the first time on a November evening years ago, and that she still, after all this time, found was worth every difficulty that had preceded it. "Both of us," he said. "Both of us," she confirmed. He hung up his coat and came to sit at the kitchen table, and she poured the coffee that was ready on the stove. And Clara Adelaide came in from the back garden, where she had been conducting some investigation of the natural world that she would report on extensively at dinner. And Kit came in behind her tracking mud, with the enthusiasm of a dog who has had an excellent afternoon. "Kit dug a hole," Clara Adelaide reported. "How large a hole?" Lenora asked. Clara Adelaide spread her arms to indicate a diameter that was probably an exaggeration but was in the right order of magnitude. Abel looked at Kit with the expression of a man making a considered assessment. "Kit," he said. Kit sat down and looked modest. "We'll fill it in tomorrow," Abel said, and reached over to accept the coffee Lenora was handing him, and their fingers touched in the passing of the cup in the way they had touched 1,000 times, the easy habitual contact of two people who have built something together and know its value. There was one more thing that happened, some years later, that belonged to this story and that Lenora thought of when she thought of what their life had added up to. In 1891, a young woman arrived on the morning stage from Wichita, carrying a single leather satchel and looking around the Caldwell street with the expression of someone doing a rapid assessment of a new situation. She was 23 years old, a school teacher, and she had come because the town's schoolhouse position had been advertised and she needed the work. Her name was Alice Marsh, and she had dark eyes and a direct way of looking at the world, and she was 23 cents short of what she needed for her first week's board at the Caldwell boarding house while she waited for her first month's salary. Lenora Alden Weston, who was sitting in front of her shop on Main Street taking advantage of a fine September morning to do some hand-stitching, watched the young woman get off the stage and take stock of herself with the brisk, contained composure of someone who is not going to let their situation defeat them. She recognized it absolutely. She stood up, walked to the woman, introduced herself, and said, "You look like you've just arrived and might need a cup of coffee and someone to tell you which of the shopkeepers are reasonable and which ones you should be careful of." Alice Marsh looked at her with a slight startlement and then said, "That would be very helpful. Yes." They went to the small cafe that had opened on 2nd Street, and Lenora ordered coffee and a piece of the pie that had no business being as good as it was in a town this size. And over the course of an hour, she told Alice Marsh what she needed to know about Caldwell and learned what Alice needed and quietly calculated the 23 cents and reached into her own pocket. The coin she put on the table was a quarter, because she did not have anything smaller, and also because she remembered very clearly that being given exactly what you needed was not less meaningful than being given slightly more. "For your board," she said. "Pay it back if you like and don't worry about it if you can't." Alice Marsh looked at the coin for a moment, and then at Lenora with the expression of someone recognizing that they have received something that is larger than its denomination. "Thank you," she said. "You'll pay it forward," Lenora said. "People usually do." She walked home that afternoon in the September sun and found Abel on the porch, which was where he was increasingly to be found in the quieter years, reading or watching the street or simply sitting in the particular manner of a man who has learned to be comfortable in his own company while also being deeply glad of someone else's. He looked up. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," she said. "A new schoolteacher arrived. Alice Marsh. She seems capable." "Good. Henry's been saying the school needs someone with more expectations of the students." She sat down beside him. The sun was warm and the light was long and golden in the specific way it was in Kansas in September, the light that had been above this place when she arrived and that she had come to love in the way she had come to love everything about this place, slowly, with full knowledge, without illusion. "I gave her a quarter," she said. He looked at her. "She was short," she said. "For her board." She had the expression. She paused. She had the expression of someone counting what they had and finding it not quite enough. He was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was thinking about Hannigan's General Store and a Liberty-seated dime warm from his pocket. "A quarter," he said. "I didn't have anything smaller." That was generous. "It was 25 cents, she said, with the particular composure of a woman who has been loved well for long enough to say it without self-consciousness. "You gave me everything you had. I know the difference." He reached over and took her hand in the familiar, deliberate way, the way that after all these years still felt like being claimed and chosen and known. "We've come a long way from that counter," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you glad?" She looked at him, this man who had been arrogant and contained and quietly generous and stubbornly principled and endlessly surprising and absolutely, unwaveringly hers, and she thought about the stage from Wichita and the 40 cents in her satchel and the flat copper sky, and the moment a coin landed on a counter with the ring of something beginning. "Every single day," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it, and they sat together in the September afternoon, Marshal Abel Weston and Lenora Alden Weston, in front of the house they had built together on the edge of a town that had tested them and held them and become home. Inside, Clara Adelaide was doing her lessons with the concentrated intensity of a girl who intended to have opinions about everything and be qualified to hold them. Kit was asleep under the table with the satisfaction of a dog whose life had exceeded all reasonable expectations. Henry's latest letter from the university in Lawrence, where he was in his second year of reading law, sat on the kitchen table. He wrote every week long detailed letters full of ideas and arguments and occasional requests for Lenora's specific opinions on specific questions, and she answered all of them at length, because he was her son, and he deserved the full engagement of a mind that had always known its own value. The Kansas sky above them was the same sky it had always been, vast and indifferent in its grandeur, stretching away in every direction further than any eye could follow. Beneath it, in the small, warm light of a porch on the edge of town, two people sat with their hands joined and their life between them, built from the simplest of starting points. One coin, given without hesitation, because someone needed it and someone else had it to give. The prairie grass moved in the light afternoon wind. The town made its ordinary sounds. Somewhere down the street, a child called out in a game and another answered. Abel Weston's thumb moved across the back of Lenora's hand in a small, habitual circle, and she leaned her head very slightly toward his shoulder, and the afternoon light held them both in its long September gold, and everything that needed to be resolved had been, and everything that needed to be kept was kept, and the story of how they had found each other across a counter and a coin, and a moment of pride laid down, was complete in the best possible way. Not with an ending, but with a life ongoing and whole, every day of it chosen.